just after 1 o'clock on the 26th of July 2018. Welcome to podcast 23, and I'm going to deal here with chapters 3 and 4 of the Golden Chain of Homer. And these are going to be the last two pieces of the Golden Chain which I'm going to discuss at present. I return to this book later on in order to elaborate on other arguments about Hermetism and alchemy. In the next series of podcasts, I'm going to begin discussing laboratory alchemy itself and how the practice of laboratory alchemy in ancient times, or at least in the classic era of Western Hermetic alchemy, contributed to the design and concepts which were presented in chapters 1, 2, 3 and 4 of the Golden Chain. So here we go, chapters 3 and 4.
So we're continuing our consideration of the Golden Chain of Homer at chapter 3. And the heading or title of chapter 3 is How All Things Are Further Generated. What this title is referring to is that on one hand, he's going to repeat what he's already said up to this point, but he's also going to add a little bit more detail and kind of run the whole scheme as one flowing explanation. How all things are further generated. So here we start. We have demonstrated that the primordial vapor, or that fire and water, are after God the first matter of all things. So remembering that the original fire, the universal fire, which was cold, dark and immaterial, condensed itself into a vapor because of that coldness, and that vapor has at its center, hidden in its core, still that universal fire. So now he's telling us about that vapor, that it contains fire and water, and that after God, which is the source of our reality, that fire and water, or that vapor, is the first matter of all things. This is the primordial prima materia. This twofold vapor, it's twofold because it has fire hidden internally and it is also water, by insipisation is become water, and this water, by the action of the invisible spirit therein diffused, has begun to ferment and then generate matter. So the vapor is twofold because it contains fire and water. Insipisation is a term which means condensing, basically. So it's condensed from that original cold fire. It has become water, or a vapor. And this water, this vapor, by the action of the invisible spirit, or fire, therein diffused, in other words, that fire or spirit is diffused throughout all of that ocean of vapor. It's internal, it's everywhere in that vapor, has begun to ferment and then generate matter. In other words, that internal fire inside the spirit, inside the water, has begun to ferment that water. It's warming the water up, and that water, once it is fermented, begins to separate, and that separation generates physical matter. So we're talking about a step-by-step scaling down of that original universal fire to the point where it becomes physical matter. And this is the point of this passage that you've got on the screen at the moment. The author wants to point out that that invisible, cold, dark, non-physical fire, through a series of stages, has become a vapor. That vapor is warmed, it ferments, and then generates physical matter. So that fire has become physical substance, and therefore that physical matter is entirely infused with that universal fire and is composed or made of that universal fire. At first, this water was perfectly subtle and pure, and he's talking about that vapor again, and by means of the action of the inward spirit, which is that universal fire, it becomes turbid, and turbid means it becomes like muddied or dirty and begins to putrefy. It smelled badly, and in this way it generated earth. And later on in the Golden Chain, they provide experiments, which anybody can do, with water, which show that that water can move from that so-called or perceived homogeneous state, where it's only water, and then through a very careful, gentle putrefaction, it generates a solid body which precipitates out of it. At first, this water was perfectly subtle and pure, and he's talking here about that original vapor that has the internal fire in it which warms it. But by means of the action of the inward spirit, that internal universal fire, it becomes turbid. In other words, it putrefies, becomes muddy, or not polluted, but a grosser matter begins to appear in it. It then smells badly, and this way, and through this action, or thus, it generated earth. So this original water was divided by this means into various parts, into a spiritual part, which is the most subtle level, the most volatile level of that original water, into a half or less subtle part, into a half corporeal part, and into a body. And we can see this is like a hierarchy of substances, that this original water was divided into 4 and then 5 specific substances. So he wants to now point out that this progression from the original vapor to the point where it becomes earth is like a mathematical function, that the universe is based on an orderly and proportional progression. So he says first it was 1 and then 2. Then it was 1, 2 and 3 things. Likewise, then it became a 4th thing and eventually a 5th thing. So this is really a Kabbalistic view of that original unfolding of that universal vapor. Now he's going to explain these numbers in more detail. It was 1 as that simple, pure, original humidity or vapor. Then it became 2 because it was that vapor containing a fire, that original universal spirit. Then it became 3 things, when it was separated into a volatile part, a half fixed part, which means half fixed, half volatile, and a fixed part. So that's 3 levels in the hierarchy of density of substance that original vapor has turned into. So he says that is, chemically speaking, and remember when he says chemically speaking that he's talking in the 1700s of their view of chemistry. Therefore, chemically speaking, we would say that it was divided into volatile, acetum, and alkali. In other words, a volatile liquid that easily evaporates. Acetum refers to vinegar, and this is a code term. It doesn't actually mean acetic acid as it would in modern chemistry. He simply is referring to a universal acid, which the code name for in the acetate path approach to alchemy was acetum. So he's saying a volatile substance, an acid substance, and an alkali substance, what we in modern chemistry call a base. So he's saying that this universal vapor developed 3 conditions of being: volatile liquid, which is like a vaporous spirit, an acid, and an alkali. And the kind of spiritual terminology, the traditional classic alchemical terminology for these 3 substances which developed is anima, which means soul, spirit, and corpus, which means body. So this is where we originally get the terms in the Western world: soul, spirit, and body. These terms are bandied about commonly at the popular level of Western occultism, and they're often used, like spirit and soul are often used interchangeably, and people don't really know at the popular level of Western occultism what these terms actually refer to, so they feel it's perfectly acceptable to use them interchangeably. But these terms actually refer to specific substances and to specific non-physical conditions. So a soul isn't just anything you want to call it to be, it's a specific thing. A spirit isn't just anything you want it to be, it is a specific condition or substance. And of course the same with corpus or body. So we've had 1 thing, we've had 2 things, now we have 3 things that have been generated out of that original volatile vapor, universal vapor. And those 3 things, of course, are the 3 alchemical principles. The 4th thing, or the condition where that vapor has become 4 things, when it was divided into the 4 so-called elements: fire, air, water, and earth. So these 4 elements come out of the original 3 principles. The original 3 principles came out of the first 2 conditions, fire and water, which themselves came out of the original humidity, the original universal vapor. And then lastly, the 5th condition. When it is by art, and that refers to alchemy or science, by art, in other words, something that a human being has done instead of nature, assisted by nature, in other words, this art or alchemy must follow the path of nature. You can't just make things up and have them be whatever you want to be. You must have alchemy being assisted by nature. Alchemy must follow the path of nature, the rules of natural law, is then formed into an indestructible, fiery quintessence, Thus it became the fifth element. And the fifth element is the entire focus of that art. Alchemy is designed specifically to take substances and convert them into the quintessence or fifth element. That's very important. That's the goal and the purpose of alchemy. No matter what anyone else thinks or what they like to tell you, this is the entire point in alchemy. The production of quintessences. Quintessences, which is not a word that you just used to refer to any kind of extracts or anything. The quintessence is a specific thing. It's not the first four elements, it is a fifth element, a specific state or condition of existence. Therefore, when the water has attained to its term of putrefaction, in other words, when that original universal humidity has putrefied as much as it possibly can and then stops, we may separate one subtle after another. In other words, now that it's converted itself into those four elements, we can separate those four elements from each other and contain them separately. The most subtle will certainly ascend before the less subtle. And he's talking here about distillation. If you now take that fully putrefied universal vapor and start to distill it, the most subtle level will come off first, then the next subtle level, then the next grossest level, and then finally the most gross level will be left behind in the distillation flask. And so one principle after another can be divided until the least volatile comes last, and that is the most gross level of matter, which is the physical substance. God had ordained that the different modifications of the universal spirit in the four elements should continually generate and produce a universal general sperm. For that reason, God has given to each individual thing its agent and its patent in order to cause a reaction. In other words, the process which generates those four elements out of the universal spirit also contains another process which generates a general universal sperm. And what they mean by general universal sperm is a fructifying or germinating force or substance. And so the ability for conditions of the four elements to regenerate themselves and reproduce themselves, that reproductive ability is contained in the whole system as well. And so everything that is produced from the original four elements also contains its own adaptation of those four elements. In other words, for example, a human being is composed of the four elements, so is a plant, so is a whale, so is a tree. And the four elements that, for example, compose a tree also contain within themselves the ability to reproduce. And this is done through what the author calls the agent and the patient or patent. And these are two binary poles of a single system. They are separated, they are counter-gender, and they are designed in that way in order to be able to cause a reaction in each other. The agent can cause a reaction in the patent in order to reproduce itself. this we see by the evaporation of numberless subjects. And he's here talking about the fact that alchemists have taken natural substances from out of nature, from out of the world, and they have sealed them up in distillation trains and distilled them in a particular way, which is peculiar to alchemy. And when these substances are distilled, he says they send forth whatever humidity, in other words, first thing that comes off all things when you distill them is a kind of liquid vapor, then have more than is necessary. This evaporation, when from above, is called influence. But when from things here below, it is called effluvium. That's a Paracelsian term. What he's saying here is that when the force which is causing the evaporation of substances or conditions, in other words, the separation of them into their various components, that force, when it's coming from above, from the internal or higher levels, that force is called influence. The common term for it, of course, is spiritual influence. When the spiritual realms cause something to be divided into its various levels of subtlety. But when that distillation or evaporation is caused from below, such as in alchemy or through the physical mechanism of a living system, that the produce of that distillation is called effluvium. Bit of a technical issue there, which isn't that important as far as the kinds of things we're discussing. So God has given each individual its particular sperm, and by individual he means each species, which, however, all depends on the universal sperm. So that means that the sperm or reproductive faculty in all species all come from the original universal reproductive faculty. Things can only reproduce because the universal original condition gave that reproductive faculty to all things. They inherited it from the universal sperm, and each individual species has that reproductive faculty but adapted to its own species. And that reproductive faculty, the universal sperm, is the ruler and conductor or governor of all of the subspecies. After the universal sperm, every species that has the ability to reproduce itself, that universal sperm rules and conducts them. In other words, develops and evolves them. So now, chapter 4. So the title of chapter 4 is How the Universal Sperm is Generated by the Four Elements. So we've previously been told that alongside the ability for the universal vapor to be fermented and separate into four conditions, which are hierarchical in nature, alongside that ability, the universal sperm, or the ability to reproduce, is also existence and is generated by the four elements themselves, as the title for chapter 4 tells us. After God had divided or corporified, in other words made physical by stages, the anima or spirit mundi, the soul or spirit of the world, that's the original universal fire, the simple chaos into four elements, God divided the anima mundi, and the simple chaos, that simple chaos became the four elements. And this is very important because this concept is at the heart not only of alchemy but of all ancient philosophic systems which discuss how the universe was created and produced. That is, that there was originally a chaos, a vast universal vapor, which had very specific, special kind of a nature, which has been discussed previously, and that four elements were produced or extracted out of that universal homogeneous chaos. And our author now tells us that these four elements are the predominating leading principles of the creative process. So God then called them to increase and multiply, and this is obviously a kind of biblical reference here. So the author is trying to draw our attention to the fact that the process which we are discussing here is actually also explained in the Old Testament in biblical authority, and we'll talk about that in a later podcast. So the heavens and air, and this means fire, heavens means the universal fire, and the air, both animated by the universal fire, are the Father, the male, and the agent or operating principles. In other words, two of the four elements were given the masculine gender because they are animated by the universal fire as operating principles, active principles. And the other two elements, water and earth, are the mother, the female, or the passive principle. And the male was the active principle, and the female is the passive principle. Agent and passive principle. So four elements are divided into two classes, two male and two female, or two active and two passive conditions. These four are nevertheless only really two things, fire and water, because remember those four elements originally evolved out of fire and water, and therefore no matter what those four different states are now, they actually are only adaptations of the original fire and water. They are forced to engender continually a regenerated chaotic water or primordial chaos out of their center. In other words, because the four elements originated from that original chaos, they also come around in a circle, like an Ouroboros, the serpent with the tail in its mouth, and when they've completed that full circle, they regenerate or reproduce that chaotic water again. And they do this for the generation, preservation, destruction, and regeneration of all things. And this is a very important concept in alchemy and Hermetism, and it is repeated in the Golden Chain several times. That this whole process of the chaotic water producing the four elements, and then the four elements again returning to and reproducing that chaotic water, is all designed so that things can be born, generated, preserved, live a life or maintain in a state of incarnation, destroyed or killed or die, and then regenerated again. This is the Ouroboros. and the four faculties, the four actions of the four elements: generation, preservation, destruction, and regeneration of all things. All things are governed by this process, which is called the spagyric or alchemical process. And this will continue until it pleases God to calcine and regenerate the whole earth. The word calcine, for those who are not familiar with it, means to seriously heat a physical substance in order to burn it and to reduce it to ashes, until it pleases God to calcine and regenerate the whole earth. So our author here is also reminding us that this entire process which we have been discussing is actually going on in our planetary sphere, that our Earth is part of an alchemical process which has had a beginning, a generation, is preserved for millions of years. The Earth exists for millions of years, and then it will be destroyed and regenerated like all living systems. These four so-called elements, which must fabricate the universal sperm, in other words, they reproduce more of the original chaos, or regenerate the chaos. In other words, he's telling us that the concept of the universal sperm is the same thing as the concept of the chaos. The reproductive faculty in all things is that original chaos. When one extreme is considered towards another, in other words, when two poles of a binary system are related to each other, they seem contrary. In other words, they are in opposition because they are two poles, and indeed, as contraries, they cannot effect any good. Yet when they meet in an orderly fashion, they are fully capable to execute that which God has ordained them for. In other words, all binary systems exist in a state of conflict and opposition, but they are also capable of coming together in an orderly and harmonious fashion, and when that happens, they reproduce themselves. It is a natural and philosophical axiom. In other words, he's saying this is an important rule or law, which is part of alchemy and also part of Hermetism. Non transere posse abano extremo ad alterum abesc medio. That is, it is impossible to proceed from one extreme to another extreme without a medium. In other words, the two poles of a binary system cannot meet, cannot come together orderly and in a harmonious fashion without a medium through which they can act. This axiom every artist, in other words, every alchemist, ought to mind. In other words, must remember. Thousands err because they do not observe this truth. Because a large part of alchemical practice is about extracting these binary poles from physical substances and then manipulating them alchemically in order to cause them to come together again and create a clean, harmonious, unified substance. But our author is telling us here that those two extremes, those two poles, cannot come together without a medium, something that will act as their reconciler. And he's saying many alchemists make a mess of their work because they do not remember this truth. This is so in all natural things. So in other words, all living systems, that's the term usually used for what they're calling here natural things, living systems. This is so in all living systems that the most volatile principle cannot unite with the most fixed or gross or earthly principle without its proper medium. In other words, we don't just need a medium to join the volatile with the fixed. They must have their proper medium, a medium which is suited to joining those two extremes together. An artist ought to observe this constantly, that he may not lose his time, his matter, in other words, the substances that he's working on, and his money or expenses. Therefore, if you want to unite heaven or fire with the earth, and this is a reference here to the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which discusses the raising and lowering of the fire and earth in a kind of a circulatory distillation in order to unite the fire and the earth. If you want to unite the fire and the earth, convert fire into earth. Unite it first with its nearest volatile medium. In other words, unite the fire with the next level of substance in the 4-level hierarchy, and they will unite immediately. The fire will unite with the next step on that hierarchical chain of substances. When that is done, give them the water as a medium between air and earth. So air was the next step that the fire should join to. He didn't mention it in the previous paragraph, but now he's telling us the fire will unite with air, then give them the water, because that's the next step on the hierarchy of substances, which is the medium between air and earth, and they will also unite. Then add the earth, and thus you may unite fire, which is the thing we started off with earth, and fix it therein. And by fix, he means basically that you are turning that volatile fire now into a solid physical substance by marrying it with the earth. So that's the reverse of what we did with bringing the 4 elements out of the chaos. Now he's talking about reversing that process back. And so, vice versa, turn the earth into water with water, then convert that into air, which is usually done through distillation, and then the air into fire by means of air. So he's talking about how the process reverses back upon itself. And let's remember here that the title for this chapter is How the 4 Elements Regenerate the Original Chaos. So he's telling us how to reverse the process now. The heaven or fire is extremely subtle. The air is also subtle, but not as much as the fire, but 1 degree more corporal than the fire. Water is again a degree more corporal than the air, and the earth is a degree more corporal than the water. Thus we must proceed as nature does. So he's telling us that even though this process can be worked in the laboratory and we can prove it for ourselves, nature is actually also doing this at the same time. And we may then attain the quintessentificated operation. In other words, by reversing the process of the elements back to that original fire, we produce a quintessence, a 5th element. It's not any of the previous 4 elements, but it is composed of them all united into a new state, a 5th element. If we do not mind this, we can do little or nothing in alchemy. So there is the definition of the quintessence for those Hermetists who have seen that term many times, have mused over what it means, and have listened to other systems discuss what it means. There is the actual definition for the word quintessence, which is often used in the magical tradition without any reference to where the term came from and what it actually refers to. Okay, in a chemical anatomy, in other words, when we separate and divide a chemical substance, we see how the most subtle comes over first. In other words, when we distill that substance, the most volatile part of it distills first, and how nature regulates her operations. In other words, this is a natural law that governs how things are separated and does not confound one principle with another. In other words, even in that original chemical substance, even though it seems like a unit or a whole chemical condition, those four elements are actually still separate and can be divided by distillations. But let's go the most volatile and the most subtle first, and then the next less volatile, and so on. Okay, so now we're at the end of chapter 4, and this is basically the end of my discussion on the important concepts of the golden chain, except for one last thing. At the end of chapter 4, our author gives us a demonstrative experiment, and this is experiment number 1, because the golden chain contains a number of experiments. So this experiment, the first experiment in the golden chain, is designed to demonstrate and prove all of the concepts that have been discussed up until this point. So he's given the theory, and now he's going to say, this is why we know that everything I've said up till this point is accurate, because here's an experiment which shows that it's accurate. So he's saying this is the kind of experiment that we can perform. For example, here's an experiment. Take an earth out of a field or meadow, what earth you please. In other words, soil he's talking about there. So go out into a field and dig up a bunch of earth. Pour water upon it, and he actually means common H2O, so as to dilate your earth well. In other words, put your soil into a flask, a laboratory flask, and cover it in water so that it is as totally immersed in the water. Then let it stand a few days. So you'd seal the flask, leave that water and that soil in the flask for a few days, and you will find that the coarse, heavy earth settles at the bottom of the vessel. And all of us should know that that would be self-evident. You must stir this flask 3 or 4 times a day. So what you're trying to do is get the parts of the soil that will dissolve in the water to fully and properly dissolve. The water will, in the meantime, dissolve the most subtle earth. In other words, the most volatile and soluble part of the soil will now dissolve into the water. And that subtle earth, the most volatile part of the soil, is the earth's or the soil's salt. This does unite with the water as being a virgin earth. That's a special technical name that alchemists give to that earth which, once you put water on the soil, that salt dissolves in the water and basically stays bonded with the water. If you now distill that water, that a good part of that earth will come over with it. And the technical alchemical name for that salt or that volatile earth is the virgin earth. As soon as the salt or virgin earth is extracted out of the common earth, the water cannot dissolve it any further. In other words, the water will first of all only dissolve that virgin earth, and then that's it. The process stops and the two just sit there. Now you must distill this water containing the salt into a spiritual water, and you must cohobate so often until all the salt has come over with the water. So what you do is you drain the water off the soil and filter it. So you now have clean water in another flask, and you distill that water, which is what he means when he says distill it into a spiritual water. In other words, distill it over the still head. Make it as volatile as possible into a gas, because that's what happens with water when you distill it. It turns into a gas and then recondenses into water. And once you've distilled the water off, it will leave that virgin earth behind. Some of it will leave behind. And you must cohobate, which is a technical term which means pour the water back onto the dry salt so often until all the salt has come over with the water. So you repeat this process. You distill the water off the salt, you dry the salt, you pour the water back onto the salt, you distill it off again, you dry the salt, you pour the water back on, and you continue this. And every time you do this, a little more of that salt will join with the water and be distilled over with the water until there's no salt left in your boiling flask. This water now has the power to dissolve again the next subtle earth out of the soil. Because that water has joined with the virgin earth, its nature has changed, and its ability to act as a solvent has increased one step. You can then reintroduce that water to the soil, and it will take the next level of salt out of that soil and will be distilled over with that spiritual water or distilled water, just as the original virgin earth did. So you repeat the process. You distill the water off, it leaves behind a salt, you dry the salt, you put the water back on, redistill it, and so on and so forth, until you again pull over all of that salt, the second layer of salt. With this water, you may proceed in dissolving more of the remaining earth until by distillations and cohobations, that means putting the water back on the salt, you have dissolved the whole quantity and volatilized it into a spiritual water. In other words, you keep repeating this process, and then once you've lifted all the salt with the water, you put the water back on the soil, you extract the next level of dissolvable salt, you repeat the process again, then put the water back on the soil, and you continue that until all of that soil has basically been converted into water. And remember that this is what we were being told in the previous passages and chapters of the Golden Chain, that if you want earth to become fire, you have to do it by stages, by rejoining the earth with water, then once it becomes water, rejoining the water with air, and then once it again becomes air, you convert it into fire, and that way what was solid matter then becomes ephemeral fire again. This is a tedious operation. In other words, it takes many distillations and cohobations over a long period of time. But he says it's of great moment, which means it's a very important experiment and operation to carry out. In the same manner, nature operates by dissolving and coagulating, which means like thickening, until the universal sperm of all things is generated. And that's the chaos, remember. It dissolves everything by repeated circulation, by repeated distillation and coagulation. And through that means what was gross or solid becomes volatile and ephemeral, and then the universal sperm or chaos is generated again, which is the universal seed. In other words, everything comes out of that original chaos. It is the seed of all reality. The artist must observe that nature proceeds gradually, by grades or steps in a hierarchy, and regularly. In other words, those steps and grades are calculable, observable, you can put labels on them, and you can reliably reproduce the experiment, and observes time and weight, which means that the physical aspects of this experiment of converting solid matter back into ephemeral matter is calculable. It is susceptible to the observation of science, which weighs and calculates. It weighs and calculates all things. So one of the common concepts about occultism, which is had in the mainstream, that science has nothing to do with spiritual reality, is not true. Alchemists have discovered, learned and developed a method whereby all things spiritual can be measured, calculated, weighed, observed and reproduced. This is one of the core concepts of what makes alchemy so important to Hermetism, especially in the role of it as being the mother science of Hermetism. The alchemist, he must transpose the external or physical gross matter into the internal or spiritual matter and heavenly, and he will obtain more and more knowledge. In other words, by carrying out this kind of experiment and considering what this experiment actually means about the state of our reality, the alchemist will obtain more and more knowledge. This is where Hermetism originally developed from. So that's the end of chapter 4, and that's the end of our consideration of the important pieces of the golden chain of Homer, as far as our evolving, developing discussion on the nature of Hermetism and alchemy.
Okay, so now that we've completed chapters 1, 2, 3 and 4, this is the point which I hope to make about presenting this information at this point in the podcasts. That there are a lot of concepts in modern Western Hermetism that modern Western Hermetic occultists take for granted, but they have no idea where these concepts came from, and they don't even mostly care about where the concepts came from. They just assume that because they're there, part of the tradition, that they are ancient knowledge, and the ancients were wise and knew better than we did, so there's no need to question or discover the sources of any of the information that they provided. And I don't agree with that argument. It is important to understand where the source materials for all the important Hermetic concepts are, and they begin with an understanding of concepts like the prima materia, the 3 alchemical principles, the 4 alchemical elements, and the planetary concept of the basic alchemical or Hermetic astronomy. All these things are key ideas upon which the entire Hermetic philosophy is built, and it is important to know why those concepts are part of traditional Hermetism and where they came from. So few occultists outside of the alchemical area of study, outside of the alchemical discipline, have any idea where the 3 principles and the 4 elements originated from. Even a lot of people who study laboratory alchemy have no idea, because they simply don't dig deep enough in order to understand the root ideas and teachings behind these particular concepts. So here we have in the golden chain the theory part of the idea about the elements and the principles, plus the binary nature of the causal root substance of physical matter, according to Hermetism. And this theory was developed over centuries and centuries and was eventually put down on paper by German Rosicrucians around the 1700s, and because of that it appeared in the Golden Chain of Homer, which was kind of the first public revelation of these ideas and how the early alchemists had reached the conclusions about the elements and the principles that they had. So now we have in chapters 1, 2, 3 and 4 of the Golden Chain the theory about the nature of how the universe came into existence. In the next series of podcasts that I'm going to do, we're going to discuss how the old alchemists came upon this theory, because they didn't just psychically visualize or conjure up images of the creative process. It was actually part of a physical, material investigation of the anatomy of physical reality that caused the early alchemists to come up with the conclusions that we see in chapters 1 to 4 of the Golden Chain. So now in the next series of podcasts, I'm going to discuss what is probably, in my opinion, one of the most important areas of theory and philosophy concerning the practice of laboratory alchemy that exists in the canon of alchemical teachings. So we're going to talk about exactly what is known as the acetate path alchemists have taught for centuries about how they worked in the lab, and then how they took the ideas and activities that they witnessed in the lab and converted them into a philosophic system that then became the theory of the nature of creation, and then chunks of that theory have become part of common Western occult theory and practice, concepts like the elements and the principles. So in the next series of podcasts, I'm going to discuss in a lot of detail exactly what practices the old alchemists were involved in that caused them to come up with the theory that was presented in the first 4 chapters of the Golden Chain. And that, for most people, I think, even a lot of people who study and practice laboratory alchemy, the next series of podcasts is going to be a major revelation for them, because they're probably mostly unaware of the kind of ideas which I'm going to discuss and present a bit of video footage and some photography of laboratory processes. So thanks again very much for watching this podcast. Again, apologies for it taking so long for me to edit and publish this podcast. Anyone who saw my last video will know why it's taken so long. I've had computer problems and I've switched over to a Linux operating system, and it's just taken me a little bit of extra time to learn new video and graphics editing software in order to get these videos back in business again. So thanks again, and see you in podcast number 24, which will be titled something like Hermetic Alchemy, the Laboratory Tradition.